The Soviet Union was one of the most powerful countries in history, including 15 republics and the people of these republics who truly believed that they were the strongest in the world and that they were moving towards a better future. But what happened? Why did it all come to an end? The Soviet Union was an enormously big country with the borders stretching from the northern European plain all the way to the western Pacific. And as you can understand, industrialization requires a developed infrastructure, railroads, highways, airports. Given the immense size of the country, this was extremely difficult and expensive for the Soviet Union. Therefore, the Soviet Union was dependent on the exports of raw materials. Thus, share of raw materials in exports grew from 16% in 1960 to 54% in 1985. The Soviet Union also had a serious population problem. The population growth slowed down by the 1970s, which led to the labor shortages during the last decade of the Union. This happened because during the Second World War, the Soviet Union lost 13.7% of its total population. If you were a boy born in the Soviet Union in 1923, you would have only 20% chance of living long enough to see the end of the Second World War. In 23 years, 80% of the boys born in 1923 would be dead by the year 1946. This meant that the people who were supposed to have their children by the late 60s weren't alive to have them. As a result of it, the population growth slowed down. 20 years later, by the late 1980s, since the people who were supposed to be born in the late 60s weren't there to born their children, the population growth slowed down once again. This was among the foremost reasons why the rapidly growing Japan bypassed the Soviet Union by the late 1980s in terms of the size of its economy. The decrease of the population growth meant a decrease in the amount of labor power available in the Soviet Union and thus the decrease of the economic capacity of the nation. Because of the inability to industrialize, the Soviet Union became dependent on the exports of raw materials. According to the official statistics, the exports of oil and oil products rose from 75 million tons in 1965 to 193 million tons by 1985. The main reason of that was the development of the oil fields in the western Siberia. It is estimated that the profits from the oil exports increased 19.2 times between the years 1965 and 1985. Besides that, since the 1970s, the Soviet Union started to export natural gas in large amounts. The gas exports increased from 127 billion to 643 billion cubic meters. The 1980s oil glut was a serious surplus of crude oil caused by a fall in demand following the 1970s energy crisis. At the time, the price per barrel of oil was $109, adjusted for the inflation in 2019. In 1986, the price fell from $63 to $23, again adjusted for the inflation in 2019. The main cause of the glut was the decrease in oil consumption amongst the developed nations. The oil consumption in the United States, Europe and Japan fell by 13% from 1979 to 1981, a decrease which was in part caused by the increase of oil prices by the OPEC members and other oil producers. Since the Soviet Union was dependent on the oil and gas exports, hence as much as 38.90% of the Soviet Union's GDP in the year 1990 was produced by the extraction of raw materials, the collapse of the oil prices in 1980s played a crucial role in the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Partially as a result of the declining oil prices, the Soviet Union's economic growth slowed down to 2.4% a year. By the end of the 1980s, the economic conditions were so harsh that even the basic necessities were gone from the shelves. In fall of the 1989, the Soviet government issued coupons on sugar, something that hasn't been seen since the Second World War. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, the two military superpowers. The pressure forced the Soviet Union to increase its military expenditure, which combined with the economic problems described, brought the Soviet Union to the bankruptcy. Because of the military race with the United States, the Soviet Union constantly viewed the American forces in Europe and Western Pacific as a threat. Therefore, the military expenditure was high. For example, according to SIPRI, in 1988, the Soviet military expenditure was 15.8% of the gross domestic product. According to the US government sources, since the mid-80s, the Soviet Union devoted on an average between 15 and 17% of its gross national product. This factor alone created a major pressure on the Soviet economy. The Soviet leadership, however, was well aware of the problems and tried to solve them by restructuring the economy and society. In the years 1983 to 1984, under the orders from Yuri Andropov, the General Secretary of the USSR, previously the head of the KGB, the planning of the economic reforms began. The word perestroika itself was first used by Mikhail Gorbachev, which referred to the restructuring of the society and economy into a more liberal system. The Soviet government hoped that the reforms would allow the Soviet economy to adapt to a new reality. Among the reforms were the glasnost, which referred to a greater liberty of the media. Other changes also included the attempt to improve relations with the United States in order to relieve the necessity to have large military expenditures. Nevertheless, as Gorbachev himself stated, the old economic system collapsed before the new one had a chance to begin working. The disintegration of the Soviet Union was a result of its inability to industrialize because of its geography, which led to its dependency on the exports of raw materials, demographic decline, which resulted largely because of the Second World War, and the Cold War, which forced it to increase its military spendings. Looking at the Soviet example is important to understand Russia's current geopolitical perspectives.